Hey small groups, Ben here again, and we are finishing out our series of Waitlisted, where we're continuing this conversation of what it is that we're called to do as Christians when we're in seasons of waiting. And maybe you've been waiting for the end of this series, but I pray that you still get something from this message and this idea that we're talking about of what it is that we can expect God to do in the middle of our waiting and understand that He is at work in that waiting. I know that to be true in my life, and that's actually what I wanted to share with you guys. That's why I had this amazing drawing of the United States behind me that I wanted to share. You see, my story actually coming to all of you was one that started long before I ever showed up here at Shepherd's Gate, which was 10 months ago. You see, I actually grew up, you guys are somewhere down here. I grew up, here I am, in, Colquhoun, Michigan, tiny little no-name town that's a little bit north of Bay City. Then I grew big, and then I decided at the end of high school, beyond where all of you guys are at, that I decided that I wanted to go to school over in Chicago. So here I am at Chicago, and I'm learning, so maybe I'm holding a nice book or something, and I'm there. I spent 5 years there, actually, 4 years studying, then another year-long internship, which is a little bit south of Chicago. So I just moved maybe like 45 minutes, and there I was. So I spent 5 years there, and then God worked in my life and my wife's life, and we got called away from Michigan, even further. This is where we wanted to be. We'd been married for a little bit, and we wanted to be close to family, but God called us all the way here to St. Louis. And so I'm married at this point, and we spend time growing in my wife's much prettier than that. I'll give her nice pretty hair. And we spent time growing in our careers and in our hobbies and in our relationship. And we've spent a total of 5 years here. So I spent 5 years here wanting to grow in my education and all of that. But once that was done, I was ready to go back. But after those 5 years were up, I actually went further away from where I wanted to be. And I spent 5 years there, and God grew our family. And while we were there in that 5-year time, we had our first child, Zeke, which maybe some of you guys are familiar with. And then after that was up, I thought, actually there was a season at the end of that time that I thought I was going to come back. Actually, believe it or not, if you didn't know this, at the end of that 5 years, I was actually talking to Shepherd's Gate about coming and being the student director. That would have been a little bit over 3 years ago. And through a different series of different events, it didn't end up happening. And instead, we took a call all the way down to Houston, Texas. All right, so here we go. Here am I, and I'm a Texan now, so I have a cowboy hat. And here's my wife, and she doesn't have a cowboy hat, but she's still pretty and has her hair. And there's Zeke, and he's getting a little bit bigger. And over the course of time, we had our second son while we were there. And there's Judah. And we're at that church for nearly 3 years. All the time in St. Louis, and especially at Texas when I was wearing my silly hats, there was, in all seriousness, there were prayers, there were evenings in conversation with my wife and me in conversation with God of, God, thank you for all that you've given me. Thank you for all that you've done. But I would really like to be closer to my family. I'd really like to be back in my home state. God, can you make that happen? That was a prayer that I had prayed at the end of college. That was a prayer that was being prayed throughout my time in St. Louis. And I distinctly remember praying that prayer right around the time of the birth of my second son, while we were in Texas, just waiting for what was next for us. Really believing at that point that that's where we're going to be, but we tried to remain faithful wherever we were at. We applied ourselves to where we were at. We dug in and we built relationships in St. Louis with people that we still love to this day. And we did the same in Texas, that we were as faithful as we could be where we were planted. And God eventually answered our prayer. And in the middle of a pandemic, last year, March 15th was my first day that we were able to come here. Well, actually, you maybe know the story. We went and lived with my in-laws, and then we came back down. And that doesn't necessarily matter. But the fact is that we waited such a long season. As you guys can see, it was like 13 years before I was back in Michigan. And part of that time was in school, but a lot of that time was with my family and my young family that I was hoping to be closer to them, to my extended family, to be here. And I stand before you having that prayer answered, which is amazing, but wanting to encourage you that wherever you're at and whatever it is that you're waiting for, or whatever it is that you're hoping for your future, that we can recognize that it takes some time. We see that very clearly in the life of Joseph in the Bible. If you're not familiar, Joseph was one of 12 sons, and he was the favorite, and he knew it. His father gave him an awesome coat, and Joseph often had dreams, these like elaborate dreams. He had a dream that all his brothers were bowing down to him, and he had the bright idea that he should tell all of his older brothers that they were bowing down to him in his dreams. So he was maybe a little bit prideful. We get the sense of that. They weren't really happy with him. And actually we find out in Genesis chapter 37 that things went really south in his relationship with his brothers. Joseph was headed to his brothers, and it says, chapter 37 of Genesis, starting in verse 18, they saw him from afar, and before he came near to them, they conspired against him to kill him. They said to one another, here comes the dreamer. This is their little brother. Here comes the dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we will say a fierce animal has devoured him, and we will see what becomes of his dreams. But when Reuben, one of the older brothers, heard it, he rescued him out of the hand, saying, let us not take his life. And Reuben said to them, shed no blood, throw him in the pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him. It turns out that Reuben ended up saving Joseph's life, and in doing so, he actually ended up saving all of their lives because Joseph saves their lives later on. The reality is, though, that this was the beginning of an awful series of events for Joseph. His brothers hated him to the point, I mean, it's hard for us to wrap our heads around this. If you have siblings, you've been upset with them before, but I can't imagine you've actually been to the point where you wanted to kill them or throw them in a pit and pretend that an animal killed them. His brothers hated him. His brothers wanted him dead. They were so terribly jealous. So that was already a bad start. Then he's sold into slavery. And then as he's sold into slavery, he works his way up the ladder and becomes the head of a household. But then he gets accused of trying to have an inappropriate relationship with the owner of the household's wife. And then he's thrown in prison. And then when he's thrown in prison, he's there and he actually is interpreting dreams. And he interprets the dreams of a few people. And one of them makes it back to the court of the king. And when that person's there, Joseph surely is thinking, okay, I was thrown in a pit. And then I worked for this guy. And then I got accused of this. And then I'm thrown in prison. But now here's my chance. I interpreted this guy's dream correctly. He's there with the most powerful person, and I'm going to be able to get out because I interpreted his dream. Well, not so fast. Actually, he stayed in prison even longer after that because the person that he interpreted the dream for forgot about it. Up until a later date when the Pharaoh had a dream that needed to be interpreted. And then he remembered, oh yeah, there's this guy Joseph. Through everything that Joseph faced, he remained faithful. He remained diligent in what God had called him to do. Whether it was to follow what his father was telling him, what the head of the household was telling him to do, what he was called to do in prison, or what he was eventually called to do for Pharaoh and interpret his dreams and be one of the leaders there. And in being a leader, saving so many lives. And actually, most importantly, that we sometimes lose sight of in the story of Joseph, is it's not only that he saved so many lives, but he saved the lives of his brothers and actually the future line that would eventually lead to Jesus. Through Joseph's faithfulness, he saved lives, but he also instilled and secured the lineage that would eventually lead to Jesus, who would eventually save all people. I want to encourage you, if you're in a season where you're waiting and you're frustrated or you're hoping for something off in the future, make sure that you're having conversations. Make sure first and foremost that you're talking to God about this. Just like I was talking to God all throughout my journey, specifically about going back to Michigan, but also about many other things, of course. And make sure you're talking to other Christians. That's what your small group is for, that you can have a dialogue, a conversation, that you can have a sounding board when you're frustrated and when you're feeling low. And then make sure that you recognize that you have a God who is strong and who is able, and that he has given you ability that no matter where you're at and what season of waiting you're in, that he's called you to be faithful where he's placed you. We actually know in Galatians chapter 6, verse 9, it says this, "And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up." I'm here to tell you, wherever you're at, don't give up right now and do what God has called you to do where you're at. Remain faithful and do the work that he's placed before you. So if that's being the best son or daughter within your family that you can be, then continue to do that. If that's being the best teammate, then lean into that and be humble and work as hard as possible. If it means that you need to be a diligent student and continue to study hard, do that. And know that in doing so, that you actually being a reflection of a God who's given you his image in your life, and that you can reflect him well by applying yourself as best as you can, knowing that it's not dependent on your work, but knowing that you have a God who loves you enough and has equipped you well and wants to see you succeed, wants to see good in your life, and he wants to work through your life. So trust this much. God loves you. God sent Jesus for you. And now, knowing that you're secure in that identity as his child, and you're waiting on other good things to come in your life, do the good that's before you right now. Trust that the other things will come. And even if they don't, that God is still good and he's still working in your life. And I pray that recognizing this, that he will continue to work through your life. Just as he's been working through my life, he worked through Joseph's life. God wants to work through you in his kingdom to break through in your life and the lives of those that you come into contact with. Now, I hope and I pray that you guys have a fantastic small group discussion around this idea of what it is that you do while you're waiting and how you can continue to be faithful in the work that God has for you. Have a great discussion, guys.